大家好，我是Dale刚刚说我是白丽娟，美中关系全国委员会的副会长。我今天晚上很高兴跟你们在一起，跟一个那么充满着活力的花上主题，在一起谈50年的乒乓外交。我也很高兴有一个机会访问那个那么漂亮的南北卡州。可是有一个问题啊，我的中文没有那么好，我就是马马虎虎，所以我要请你们原谅我，如果我继续用英文说。For those of you who don't speak Chinese, I was just saying that I'm delighted to be here in the beautiful Carolinas and to be able to talk about ping pong diplomacy and tell you a few stories about that to such a vibrant Chinese community and to so many wonderful local officials who have shown their support for the community and for U.S.-China relations. Several people who preceded me have taken some of the things that I was going to talk about. Your Secretary of State, Andy Marshall, talked about the occurrence of a young hippie American player who in 1971, when Connie was in China, overslept one morning, missed his bus that was supposed to take him to practice. So he looked around and he jumped on the first bus he saw, and it was the Chinese bus. It was a little awkward because the two countries weren't supposed to be talking to one another. But Glenn was this hippie type person, and he liked to make friends wherever he was, and so he just started talking. And the Chinese were all sort of frozen because they weren't supposed to talk to Americans. But Zhuang Zedong, who was the head of the delegation, felt that he needed, because he was the head, felt that he needed to be polite, and so he made the first overture and spoke to Glenn. And besides, he had heard that Chairman Mao had recently spoken to an American journalist, so he felt he could do that as well. So by the end of the bus ride, Zhuang Zedong had given a present to Glenn Cowan, and Glenn felt that in return he needed to bring a present to Zhuang Zedong. And so the next day he came with a t-shirt, one of his own t-shirts that he gave to Zhuang Zedong with a great big peace symbol on it. And somehow the press, the media had found out about this. They were there to take pictures, and it got enormous play all around the world. Now, everybody thinks that was what started ping pong diplomacy, but in fact there's a backstory to it. For over 2 decades, the United States and China had really minimal contact, and each side vilified the other. In the United States, that began to change when Richard Nixon, ironically a politician known for his fierce anti-communist views, became president of the United States. A year before his election, Nixon had written an article about the importance of U.S.-China relations and repairing them. And Dr. Kissinger tells the story that within 2 weeks of the two men, with Nixon becoming president and Kissinger becoming the national security advisor, the president sent Kissinger a list of the top 4 or 5 initiatives that he wanted to do in foreign policy, and China was at the top of that list. That work began in several small ways that I won't go into because I know you were all waiting for your food and the chef wants to bring the food out. So I'm going to skip some of the things that I was going to say and tell you that the American side made a few singles. One of them was, American government officials always used to call China Communist China or Red China. But after Nixon came into office, they began calling it the People's Republic of China. On the Chinese side, they made several overtures as well to sort of signal us that they were ready to change the very bad relationship that we had had. So, for instance, this American journalist that Zhuang Zedong had been remembering His name was Edgar Snow, and he interviewed Mao for 5 hours, and during that interview, Chairman Mao said that, asked the journalist to go back to Washington and tell the president that China would welcome Richard Nixon to visit either as a tourist or as the president of the United States. Well, for some reason, our government didn't take them up on the offer, but when April 1971 happened, it was really hard to not pay attention to that dramatic invitation. And so the Americans and the Chinese began preparing. My organization got involved because an American journalist saw the announcement of the invitation coming across the wires one day in April of '71. She called our organization because the announcement, the news also said that the U.S. Table Tennis Association wanted to be able to offer a reciprocal invitation for the Chinese to visit this country. But USTTA was a volunteer organization. It had no money, it had no staff, it had no knowledge of anything related to China. So we saw that as an opportunity, and we offered to co-sponsor the visit. Everybody seemed to be very happy about it, although at a reunion, a 25th reunion we had, Dr. Kissinger admitted to everyone that actually he wasn't very happy when he first heard the news about the ping pong team having been invited to China, because he was engaged in a lot of secret backroom negotiations, and he was really afraid that a bunch of ping pong players would screw everything up. But he conceded that his fears hadn't come to pass and that everything went much better than he had expected. Connie and Del told you a little bit about the '71 trip to China and the '72 trip to the United States. What we did was our organization sort of split the responsibilities for the 1972 coming here. The U.S. Table Tennis Association took care of all of the matches and the practices and everything having to do with ping pong. And our organization, the National Committee, took on all the other tasks, the hotels, getting that plane that Del talked about from Pan Am, and trying to put together a program that would show our Chinese guests something about America, about our history, our culture, our society, and our values. So we put together a schedule that would introduce them to people and institutions at all various economic and social levels, from visiting the White House. I think there's some, that's actually their last day in the United States, but you've seen some pictures of President Nixon welcoming them to the White House. There have also been pictures, that picture there is Liang de Liang, and at a farm where we were in Memphis. But we wanted them to better understand the United States. We wanted them to have fun, so we took them to places like Williamsburg and Disney World and Disneyland and SeaWorld, to baseball games and to picnics. This was the first time that any Chinese national had set foot in the United States since the founding of the People's Republic, so it was a very big media story. And we had journalists from all over, not only all over the country, but all over the world, including several groups of Chinese media. So how did that interaction go with people coming from China who'd never been here before? Actually, it went really, really well. I was surprised, in fact, how well it went. Very pleased, but also surprised at how well it had gone. The Chinese who were chosen were not only great ping pong players, but they were also great diplomats. They were warm, they were charming, and they really seemed to exemplify. You've heard Connie talk about友谊第一, be赛第二, friendship first, competition second. And the team that they put together really was emblematic of that. It was funny, as they were going around the country, lots of people, not just the journalists, but almost everybody they met would ask them, so, how do you like the United States? What has surprised you about the United States? And invariably, they would say, what surprised us most is the warmth and the friendship of people in the United States and how well they've treated us. And the first few times I heard them say that, I thought, well, you know, they were probably told to say that because that's the diplomatic thing that they should say. But I have to admit that I felt the same way as I traveled around the country with them and I watched the interactions between the Chinese delegation and Americans. I was really very proud to be an American because after years and decades of being in contention with each other, and each government and media saying not such nice things about the other, the American people were really very warm and open and friendly and very eager to learn more about the Chinese. Now, I don't want to say that it was all sweetness and light. There were problems. We had several demonstrations, including the first night when a very right-wing group started throwing dead rats over the side of the bleachers onto the floor while the Chinese national anthem was being played. And there were other demonstrations from time to time, but on the whole, though those were just the exceptions, and both sides made sure that friendship theme remained uppermost. Let me just end by telling you one more anecdote having to do with友谊第一, Be赛第二. So when we were in Washington, D.C., it was April of '71, and one morning there was a knock on my door. I was rooming with the woman who was responsible for the press. And about 7:30 in the morning, there's this knock, knock, knock on the door. We open it up, and there's one of the journalists. He's a very famous American war correspondent who had most recently been covering Vietnam. And he said to us, "When are the Chinese leaving? When are they leaving?" He said, "What do you mean, when are they leaving? Look at your schedule. You'll see when we're leaving. We're going to visit such and such a place after breakfast." He said, "No, no, no. I mean, when are they leaving the United States?" And he holds up that day's Washington Post in big headlines in the newspaper. United States is bombing Haiphong Harbor. And the journalist, who had spent a lot of time in Vietnam, said, once the Chinese see that headline, they're out of here. And I want to be there to cover it. So we said, look, we know nothing about this. Go back to your room. We'll get back to you. So the woman responsible for the press and I, we go and we gingerly knock on the door of the deputy head of the delegation. We show him the headlines. He looks at the paper. He thinks for a moment, and then he says, "We're here on a people-to-people trip. This is not a government-to-government trip. We will continue with our friendship tour of the United States. 友谊第一, Be赛第二." After more than 2 decades of hostility,